Good evening from the State of Kuwait. Welcome to the 7 o'clock news for Saturday, the 25th of October 2014. I am Daria Badran with the headlines for tonight. GCC Ministers of Financial and Economic Affairs and Central Banks governors begin a joint meeting aimed at reaching common perspective regarding key economic issues. Egypt's president issues a 3-month state of emergency in Sinai Peninsula after a deadly attack. Lebanese soldiers clash with gunmen in the northern city of Tripoli for the second day. The World Health Organization reports that the number of cases in the Ebola outbreak passes 10,000 with 4,922 deaths. Hello and welcome. The State of Kuwait condemned the 2 terrorist attacks that occurred in Sinai, killing and wounding scores of the Egyptian army troops. A foreign ministry official source stated in a statement that these 2 terrorist attacks aimed at undermining Egypt's security and scaring civilians contradicted all religious and humanitarian values. The official source affirmed the necessity of the international community's solidarity with Egypt and called for doubling efforts to clamp down on terrorism that constitutes a threat to the whole region. He added that Kuwait supports Egypt in facing such threats and expressed confidence that the Egyptian authorities would succeed in eliminating terrorism and maintaining the nation's security and stability. The Minister of Interior of the Kingdom of Bahrain, Lieutenant General Sheikh Rashid bin Abdullah Al Khalifa, arrived in Kuwait today, accompanied by a security delegation to offer condolences on the passing away of Sheikh Salim Sabah Salim Al Hamoud Al Sabah at the family's diwan. Sheikh Rashid bin Abdullah was received at Kuwait International Airport by the Deputy Premier, Minister of Interior and Acting Minister of Justice, Sheikh Muhammad Al Khalid Al Hamad Al Sabah, the Interior Undersecretary, Lieutenant General Sulaiman Fahd Al Fahd, and a host of officials at the Ministry of Interior. GCC Ministers of Financial and Economic Affairs and Central Banks governors began the 60th joint meeting this weekend aimed at reaching perspective regarding key issues of common interest in the banking and monetary fields. High on the priority list are financial stability in the GCC countries, reforming the labor market to increase employment and productivity, as well as examine civil servants' pay scale and salaries in the regional states. Our reporter Badriya Al Saleh brings us this report.
The 99th meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council Financial and Economic Cooperation Committee kicked off at the Sheraton on Friday. Generally an annual meeting, the 60th meeting of the Committee of Governors of Monetary Agencies and Central Banks in the GCC member states held its second meeting for this year yesterday. The ministerial gathering addressed the outcome of the 60th meeting of the Committee of Governors of Monetary Agencies and Central Banks in the GCC member states, as well as the GCC General Secretariat's remarks on the 8th and 9th meetings of the Customs Union Authority regarding requirements to complete the union. CBK Governor Dr. Mohammed Al-Hashil led the 60th meeting of the Committee and Central Banks of the GCC, as well as participated in the 30th meeting of the Board of Directors of Gulf Monetary Council.
We discussed today, it was a very important meeting to meet with all governors from central banks in our GCC region. We discussed the important issues at the supervision level in terms of Basel III leverage ratio and all the regulatory efforts that are being used and by the teams in our central banks. Payment system was also an important and lively topic in our meeting, and we discussed the models that are possible for to interconnect central banks in the region. Anti-money laundering and combating financing terrorism was also a very important issue that we discussed. This is, in a nutshell, the important issues we have a discussion about today.
During their meeting, the GCC Central Bank governors discussed a set of significant issues bearing on ongoing efforts to promote and prop up Gulf cooperation and coordination, together with methods to hedge Gulf bank and financial sectors against the fallout of regional and international challenges. Participants also discussed what was achieved so far by the GCC Justice Ministers on the statute of the Economic Judiciary Body, in addition to the outcome of the 67th meeting of the negotiating team for resuming negotiation with economic blocs. Other issues discussed included the draft bill on finances submitted to the British Parliament and the memorandum by the GCC Secretariat on the decision taken by the 38th meeting of the Industrial Cooperation Committee on exempting oil companies from custom fees on production inputs. Meanwhile, the Financial and Economic Cooperation Committee and the Committee of Governors on Monetary Agencies and Central Banks will hold a joint meeting on Saturday to be attended by the IMF Managing Director, Christine Lagarde, to discuss issues of common interest.
At the Sheraton Hotel, I'm Badriya Saleh reporting for the English News.
Thank you, Badriya. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon strongly condemned the two terrorist attacks that targeted military checkpoints in Sinai. Ban extended this deep condolences to the families of the victims and the government of Egypt and hoped for the quick and full recovery of the wounded. For his part, President of the Arab Parliament, Ahmed bin Mohammed al-Jarwan, condemned the deadly bomb attack in the Sinai Peninsula where dozens of the Egyptian armed forces were either killed or injured. Al-Jarwan described the attack as criminal and heinous and called on international and Arab communities to give their full support to Egypt and its fight against terrorism. Meanwhile, the European Union and the United States both denounced the attack. The State Department said a prosperous and dynamic Egypt requires an environment of security and stability. The statement extended condolences to the families of the victims and underlined U.S. commitment to Egypt as a strategic partner. A coordinated assault on an army checkpoint in the Sinai Peninsula killed at least 33 Egyptian troops, prompting the Egyptian National Defense Council to place the area under the Israeli and Gaza borders in the state of emergency. The assault on Friday was the deadliest single attack in decades on the military, which has been struggling to stem the wave of violence in the peninsula. More details in the following report by Heba Abdurrahman.
In some of the worst anti-state violence in years, two attacks in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula killed at least 33 security personnel on Friday. According to sources, 30 people were killed and more than 25 people were wounded in the first attack in the Cordoba area northwest of Al Arish near the Gaza Strip, when a car bomb targeted two armored vehicles at a checkpoint near an army installation. They said the big explosion and high death toll were likely due to the vehicles being loaded with ammunition and heavy weapons. Hours later, gunmen opened fire on a checkpoint in Al Arish, killing 3 members of the security forces. There was no immediate claim of responsibility for either attack. However, similar previous operations have been claimed by Egypt's most active militant group, Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis. The violence prompted Egypt to declare a 3-month state of emergency in parts of the North Sinai where the violence took place. President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has expressed serious concerns over the insurgency after convening the National Defense Council overnight for an emergency meeting in response to the terrorist attack. For its part, the State of Kuwait strongly condemned the terrorist attacks, saying they aimed at undermining security and stability in Egypt and scaring civilians. The Foreign Ministry affirmed in a statement the necessity of the international community's solidarity with Egypt and called for doubling efforts to calm down on terrorism. The statement added that Kuwait stands on side of Egypt in face of such threats, expressing confidence that the Egyptian authorities would succeed in facing terrorism for maintaining the nation's security and stability. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon also condemned the terrorist attacks in the Sinai Peninsula, extended his deep condolences to the families of the victims and the government of Egypt, and hoped for the quick and full recovery of the wounded. The attacks are a setback for the government, which had managed over the past few months to make some progress in the struggle against a militant insurgency in the Sinai, as it focuses on trying to repair the economy.
A Syrian Kurdish leader said the battle for the Syrian town of Kobane will turn into a war of attrition unless Kurds defend it from the IS militants. IS fighters encircled the town near the Turkish border more than a month ago and are using weapons, including tanks and armored vehicles seized in Iraq to attack Kurds equipped mainly with light arms. Head of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party said the Kurds had recently received information that the IS wanted to fire chemical weapons into Kobane using mortars, and the militant group had surrounded the town with around 40 tanks. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said an agreement had been reached on sending 200 Peshmerga from Iraq through Turkey to help defend Kobane. Yesterday, Erdogan said the Kurdish had agreed to the passage of 1,300 Free Syrian Army fighters to Kobane to reinforce Kurdish forces there. Kurdish regional forces retook the northern Iraqi town of Zomar and several nearby villages from the IS insurgents on today. A Turkish intelligence officer in Zomar said Peshmerga forces had advanced from 5 directions in the early morning after coalition air strikes on IS positions. The Kurdish forces encountered fierce resistance before prevailing. The IS militant group captured large areas of northern and western Iraq and neighboring Syria, which has caused international shock. US-led airstrikes began in August in support of regional ground forces to try to reverse the militants' advance. In Lebanon, at least 16 people, including 7 soldiers, were reportedly wounded in a clash last night in northern Tripoli. The fighting came a day after troops killed 3 gunmen and detained a local leader in a raid in the northern Dinea region of Tripoli. The Lebanese army said in a statement that the clashes between the army and terrorists were ongoing, adding that the clashes had resulted in the injury of an undisclosed number of citizens. A Palestinian-American teenager has been shot dead by Israeli troops who claim they were trying to prevent a Molotov cocktail attack amid clashes near Ramallah. The U.S. State Department has called for a speedy and transparent investigation. More with our correspondent in Ramallah, Fatima Abdel Karim.
The Israeli forces shot and killed 14-year-old Arwa Hamad, a Palestinian-American, in clashes in the village of Silwad east of Ramallah last night. Medical sources said Hamad was shot in the head and passed at once. And the U.S. State Department called for a transparent and immediate investigation into the shooting.
At sunset, we heard gunshots. We rushed to see what was happening, and we saw that a military vehicle was roaming around. Urwa was hospitalized without knowing what really happened. Later, we learned that he passed.
The Israeli army said it will investigate the shooting, which occurred while clashes had erupted in Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem, particularly in Al-Isawiyah, where the result of the Israeli-triggered violence was the wounding of at least 30 Palestinians. The escalation, which broke out earlier this month, is seen by observers as a deliberate escalation.
Israel all along wants to be the only player and doesn't want to see the Palestinians with self-determination or even self-expression. Israel wants to impose the equation of security for security, not only in Jerusalem, but all across the West Bank.
Violence had sparked in Jerusalem during the Jewish Sukkot holidays, on which the Israeli authorities facilitated the entry of scores of Jewish groups to perform their prayers in Al-Aqsa Mosque complex, while it banned Palestinian worshippers from access to their holy site. 3 children were martyred in only 10 days in different West Bank cities. An escalation that many believe will trigger further violence across the West Bank as well as Jerusalem. Fatma Abdul Karim, Kuwait TV, Ramallah, Palestine.
Thank you, Fatma. Al-Qaeda militants killed dozens of Yemeni Houthi rebels today in the city of Radda in central Yemen as they pushed back the rebels' advance on Al-Qaeda stronghold. Houthi rebel forces have advanced into central and western Yemen since they seized control of the country's capital Sana'a on September 21st, taking on tribesmen and Al-Qaeda militants. Today, Al-Qaeda fighters surrounded the Houthis on a mountain in Radda at dawn and killed dozens of them and took 12 prisoners, forcing them to retreat to Namar province, although clashes continued in other parts of the city. The militants seized at least 6 armored vehicles and some weapons from the rebels as they retreated. The fighting has put neighboring Saudi Arabia on alarm. Scuffling broke out between activists planning to send propaganda leaflets to North Korea and protesters who tried to stop them in the South Korean border city of Pajo today. Tension in the Korean peninsula remains high after the North warned earlier this month that propaganda leaflets against Pyongyang and its leadership could cause irreparable damage between the two sides. About 50 activists, including some North Korean defectors, traveled to the border by bus, but were apprehended by more than 200 protesters. About 1,000 police were dispatched to the scene to stop the scuffling. In its latest report, the World Health Organization said the number of cases in the Ebola outbreak has exceeded 10,000 with 4,922 deaths. Only 27 of the cases have occurred outside the 3 worst-hit countries, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. Those 3 countries account for all but 10 of the fatalities. Mali became the latest nation to record a death of a 2-year-old girl. More than 40 people known to have come into contact with her have been quarantined. The latest WHO situation report says that Liberia remains the worst affected country with 2,705 deaths. Sierra Leone has had 1,281 fatalities and there have been 926 in Guinea. And finally tonight, over to Greece. Roads became rivers in parts of the capital Athens after regions was hit by torrential rain which swept away cars and damaged homes and businesses. Elsewhere, cars were seen overturned or stacked on top of each other after being battered by the torrential rain, and power cuts were also reported in several areas. The Greek Prime Minister is expected to hold an emergency meeting after returning from an EU summit in Brussels. This is the end of tonight's news. A reminder of the headlines. GCC Ministers of Financial and Economic Affairs and central banks governors begin a joint meeting aimed at reaching common perspective regarding key economic issues. Egypt's president issues a 3-month state of emergency in Sinai Peninsula after a deadly attack. Lebanese soldiers clash with gunmen in the northern city of Tripoli for the 2nd day. The World Health Organization reports that the number of cases in the Ebola outbreak passes 10,000 with 4,922 deaths.